Excellent. Welcome to our session and as we slide into the afternoon of AJAX 2018, we are going to be presenting for you a JavaScript for Salesforce, a beginner's guide. And as Peter was just commenting on, we are going to be trying to give you kind of an introduction to the JavaScript language, centered around a little bit of its history, a little bit of its importance in web development. You know, we're going to give you some kind of guidelines as like where this can be used with the Salesforce platform. But our goal is to demystify it as a language for you, so that when you go to use it for your first Heroku web application, when you're using it with SFDX to create a plugin, when you're going to go create that Lightning controller, that you've got the nouns and the verbs and the way that it really interacts, so that you have an understanding of how the language is really working. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, our lawyers would like to remind you that if you're going to make any purchasing decisions, please make them based on current features and not any forward-looking statements that myself or Peter might make. I don't plan on making either. I don't think Peter does either.
I don't plan on it.
We really aren't talking about the future. A lot. We're talking a lot about the past, to be quite honest.
More than a history lesson than anything.
Right. So if we do, we will try to call it out, though. Let me introduce myself. My name is Joshua Burke. I'm a developer evangelist at Salesforce.com, and you can catch me on Twitter at Josh Burke. And Peter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Peter Chittum, also a developer evangelist. I'm based in the UK, even though I don't sound like it. And yes, you can also catch up with me on Twitter at pchittum.
Okay, so this is one of the first secret prizes for coming to this session. My goal is to start with kind of a history of the language, and I kind of want to start with my own personal history with JavaScript. And so this picture is a picture of myself. I'm the one on the left, in case you can't tell. I'm about 20 years younger and about 40 pounds lighter, give or take.
I didn't recognize you.
It's a rough math, okay. And I'm there with my friend Ken and my friend Sam, and we are out front of Netscape headquarters. And we were there on a business trip because we all worked for a insurance company, let's just say based in central Illinois. Don't need to get more specific than that. And at the time, I was just kind of this young kid right out of college, and one of the things that I was really good at was basically just creating web pages, and I got hired by this company to help them prop up their first ever intranet. And while it was actually shortly after this trip, the gentleman on the right, that being Sam, he gave me this little piece of advice. He said I really, really needed to learn a real language. See, I wasn't a computer science major in college. I was a psychology and English double major of all things. I actually wandered into web development through my English professors who were interested in hypertext as like a delivery medium. And that's really where my roots as a web developer began, was communicating people through technology, but in this very kind of static kind of way. Sam was a hardcore computer science guy and like a Java developer since the day was young. And so he's like, JavaScript is a tinker toy language. It doesn't really do anything. And to give him some context, right, like we can kind of laugh at it now, but when I was at this company, one of the things that I did is I created a cross-browser JavaScript library primarily focused on having Internet Explorer and Netscape do the same things when you did things like roll over an image or create a new div or have something be a little bit more interactive, because that was really, at the time, the role of JavaScript. It was there to make the pages more interactive. So it was kind of like how we briefly used Flash, before we were using Flash and then after Flash, but anyway. But the goal was not as an application. What we were doing then, my tool for creating like a server-side experience to create kind of an end-to-end application, I was actually a Perl developer. Any Perl developers in the room? Yes, Perl developers represent. Like there's always a couple of us out there, right? And Perl had a few advantages to it. Now the company was also using Java. It was also using active server pages. You can kind of see this growing dichotomy that they seem to enjoy, like pitting Java versus Microsoft, Sun versus Microsoft was kind of a culture thing back then. So being a Perl developer had two advantages. One, it was free. Well, three advantages. One, it was free. Two, I could put it on nearly any server I wanted and nobody would complain about it. And three, if I got into a room and the Microsoft and the Sun guys started arguing with each other, I'd just be like, I'm a Perl guy. I'm going to be over here. And so the way we created applications back then was by having something send a lot of information up to the server doing a lot of processing, and then the server sending one big page back down to the browser. So it's very monolithic. We represent a page, we get it some information, we send all of the possible information over, do a lot of processing, send the whole page back. It worked pretty well at the time. But then something better came along. It was actually the Outlook web application team that invented AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And I'm actually going to pause here a second. This is a really good time to remind us JavaScript has really very little to do with Java. It's actually originally called LiveScript. It was renamed Java before it was released into, I think it was Netscape 1, because Java was very popular. It was a really good marketing ploy. AJAX actually is not dependent on XML. You don't have to use XML with it. It was called AJAX. In fact, the technical library used for it is XML HTTP request, because the Outlook web application team wanted it released with Internet Explorer, and so they got an agreement from the XML libs team to get it put into that library. And in order to do that, they had to include XML in the name. So JavaScript has this funny way of trying to tell you it's sort of doing one thing, and it's really doing another thing. And Peter will get to more of that in a little bit.
Yeah. Although I have to say it's like some amazing stakeholder management on the part of the Outlook team to make that happen.
Right. So. If I could ever get something released just by changing the name of it, remind me to do that. I will do that. So what AJAX allowed them to do was fundamentally change that flow that I was just describing, where instead of the browser sending one huge request up, having a lot of server processing happening, and then sending one whole page back, now JavaScript had this ability to directly ask the server the kind of question it wanted and to get the kind of response it wanted. And this allows for very, very discrete actions between the client and the server, and then back again. So the simplest way I can describe it is, let's say you have a form. That form has 10 fields on it. If we go with the route on the left, you have to always send all 10 fields back, wait for something to happen, and then tell the user what happened. With AJAX, if you want to check, say, the validation of a phone number and whether or not it exists in the database, you can just very quickly in the background send that back to the server. The user is still looking at the page, nothing has changed, and then the server comes back and says, oh, that's not a valid phone number. And you can automatically update that page with that information. It makes for a much faster, much more discrete loop between the user, the server, and the interface that they're working with. And what this allowed the Outlook web application team to do was to start taking pages. So remember, I'm an English major. I started thinking of pages as ways to communicate information, paragraphs, headlines, text, bling tag. Anybody remember bling tag? I used that a lot. To making it into an application, into something that we think of when we pull up our desktop and we're actually using it more like an app. That was the rise of things like Outlook, Gmail, Netflix, Pandora. When we start looking at the web as a series of applications, this was the evolution that allowed that to happen. And then in 2009, we got Node, and that started to move all of this away from just the browser and onto the command line and onto the server. Now, from a Salesforce point of view, all of this evolution has become very, very important. And we can think of it as three key chunks. On the command line, how many people have used SFDX at this point? Okay, SFDX is basically a combination of Go and Node. And we also just released, not me and Peter, we had absolutely nothing to do with it other than being told it was released, but just recently, Salesforce released to the open source OClif, Open CLI Framework. It allows you to very easily add plugins into SFDX, and it's all written in Node. So it's written in JavaScript. From a server-side point of view, if you want to prop up a web application on Heroku, you can do almost the entire thing in JavaScript at this point. You can use the server-side in Node. You can use Express as your middleware. JSForce Enforce to talk back to Salesforce. You can use JavaScript as the object notation for your data when you're using something like Redis. And this is where we're going to focus on today because it is probably going to be your most common touch point when it comes to JavaScript and the Salesforce platform are our browser-based frameworks. And so this is where if you went back to that little library that I wrote for this company, you would probably find it pretty humorous at this point. It's about 100 lines of code in totality, right? Compare that to what we do with Lightning, Angular, and React, and it's relatively simplistic. So with Salesforce, obviously Lightning components, that's what drives our Lightning experience. And if you want to start building out custom interfaces for your users, that's going to be a good thing on your tool belt. All the way down to React. How many people have tried, we have a Quip Live app over at Camp Quickstart. Anybody try that? So if you want to add custom functionality to your Quip documents, you can do that using something called a Quip Live app. And it's effectively a React application, which is a JavaScript framework. So thankfully, I did learn a real language. At the time, I didn't know I was learning a real language. I did learn a real language, and it is something that has really started to kind of take over the world in terms of the things that you can do with it. And it's probably, when people ask me, I want to get into programming, what should I start with? I have started to gravitate to say, go learn JavaScript. It's a language that has a lot of common grammar with other languages, and it has so many use cases to it that's a great way to start. So on that note, let's learn some JavaScript.
Cool.
I'm going to hand things over to Peter, and he is going to start walking through the inner workings of a controller.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so we're done with the expert now, and you have me to deal with at this point. So my JavaScript background was a little different, although it goes pretty far back as well, where I actually first learned JavaScript in around 2000, 2001 on a server-side framework, which way predates Node. And it's not how most people learn JavaScript, but that was kind of how I was exposed to it as a scripting framework for an inbound marketing campaign engine that I was working with at the time. So it was it was a very different way of thinking about JavaScript than what it was at the time, which is, parlor tricks on your web page. And then I kind of left it alone until about 2013, actually, and the landscape had changed so massively. So I've been going through a process for the last 4 or 5 years of trying to learn JavaScript, but even still, I do not consider myself an expert. I mean, I feel like there are some things I really understand, and there's some things that I kind of understand, but I do feel like, if I want to make Lightning work and make JavaScript work in Salesforce, I feel like I'm pretty good with that today. And when Josh and I sat down to plan out what would be the thing to help break open JavaScript for the world of the Salesforce developer, we thought, well, you can't really go wrong with picking one particular pattern that happens over and over again in Lightning components and just picking through that and trying to talk about what are the underlying JavaScript structures and features and patterns that we're taking advantage of in this code. So the code you see on the slide is a pretty classic thing that you'll see in Lightning components, which is how do you interact with the server from your Lightning component. Who here has started to use Lightning and JavaScript already? Okay, so a fair portion of you, and you'll probably recognize that this would probably be a helper method or a helper function. That's where it comes in. Now, the one thing that we'll say is that we aren't going to focus on the exact use case of this function. I think to understand what's going on, you don't necessarily need to know that from the JavaScript standpoint. But we did steal this function from a Trailhead project. So actually, everybody here can go and build that project. We'll give you the link to that in a Trailmix at the end of the session. And then you can actually create this particular function yourself. And then hopefully from having been to the session, you'll understand what you're doing a little bit better than just copying and pasting the function like you can do in projects. So that's the goal, is let's demystify what's going on here and try and understand what is JavaScript doing. The first lesson we thought would be really good to start with is it's something you hear a lot when you first learn a little bit about JavaScript, which is everything is an object. And so we've called out in bold here a number of different places where objects exist in this code. The first one at the top you see is, I think, probably the most interesting, and for me it was the most unique thing to find in JavaScript, which this particular syntax is called object literal notation. And it looks like JSON. So if you've worked with JSON before as a data structure, you can actually use a very similar structure to declare objects, variables, and functions within those objects. And so rather than having to sort of imperatively say, here's an object, I'm going to assign this function and assign this function, you literally create what looks exactly like the object in a JSON structure, and then it's actually a functioning object. There's a bunch of other objects down below as well. So this, state, console, and $A are all objects that refer to different bits of the execution context. So this refers to the component itself. State refers to something that is getting back. It's basically the result of the server response that's happening here. Console refers to the output. So if you want to see developer output for debugging, you do that from console.log. And then $A is the sort of underlying Aura object behind Lightning components. So there's a whole bunch of helper functions that hang off of that at the bottom there. And to actually, switch and look at a different example, we've created some JS bins. So JS bin is like JS fiddle. I tend to use it because I'm based in the UK and the guy who wrote it is from the UK. So that's there's no reason you could do the same thing in JS fiddle. So in the first bit here, I'm doing kind of the imperative declaration of an attribute in object 1 and a function in object 1. Okay, so and this is an interesting thing, is I can actually assign a function to a member of an object imperatively, like you see there. Now, conversely, and this is actually how Lightning Components likes to do it, anytime you build a Lightning Component helper or controller, you're going to use this object literal notation. So object 2, we're actually assigning the object and then explicitly naming the members using that JSON-like structure, or JSON-like syntax again, that's object literal notation. These two objects internally are completely identical, and you can see that in the console log calls down here, right? And when I click on run, we'll see the output of that. So, the output of object 1, some data, object 2, some data, those will be the same. Same thing with the invocation of the function. And then the last thing we kind of wanted to underscore this idea that everything is an object, I created an array. And it's actually something I like about JavaScript, is you can sort of implicitly say, well, here's 2 square brackets. We now know this is an array. So that's kind of how JavaScript works, is there's a lot of implicit stuff. They're all stated rules. It's not like it's hidden somewhere, but knowing the implicit stuff is often the key to success. And so if I go and click on run here, then we'll see, these lines here. You can see the output from object 1 and object 2 are the same. And we can see that my array is an object, as is one of those 2 objects as well. So that type of function is basically going and saying, tell me what this thing is. And we'll get to some special objects as well a little bit later. All right, so let's move on. So the next thing we want to talk about is assigning and storing values. When you assign something to a variable, what is actually happening? And we have a couple of examples of that in this code here. So component.get, we're assigning something to action. We have an example down here where we're assigning something to badges as well. Okay? So let's pop over and see some examples of this in our sort of alternative universe code. And so I'm back to this object 1. I use that exact same declaration. And so some data, that's a string. Some function is a function. And what's going to happen is when I do my type of, right, my type of object 1 is going to say object. My type of object 1 some function will actually say function. So function is one of those special objects that actually has its own prototype to identify what it is. And then we know what happens with the array. So again, just like I can do object literal for an object, I can literally enter in what looks like an array and have that be assigned as well. So it's a nice little shortcut. The last thing I wanted to show is down here, which is object1.someFunction. What happens if I assign something new to some function? And this is one of those things where you need to know that JavaScript will let you shoot yourself in the foot if you pick up a gun and point it at your foot and pull the trigger. It will do very little to stop you from doing that. Now, that's getting better with some of the new specifications that are coming up with ES6. Actually, now they're calling it ECMAScript 2016 and 2016A or plus,
right,
thank
plus,
you.
yeah.
So, but the specifications are starting to give you more tools to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And I'll get to that. So let me run this first here. And so we can see that the first time we check the type of on some function, we end up with function, cool. But then after we've attempted to assign the string, sure enough, JavaScript has said, sure, okay, we can have that be a string now if that's what you want.
It thinks it's being helpful.
It does think it.
That's the delightful part of it.
And that's actually the underlying principle of a lot of how JavaScript was designed from the outset, which is like, how do we help this not fall over, right? And so it would kind of make choices for you without you wanting it or knowing it. So yeah. So one of the recent specifications that's been added to address this exact problem is that there's now a const declaration. So this last bit here that we'll cover here, const my constant equals hello. Now, the first time I ran this, I didn't have any problems. But if I uncomment the line, where I'm going to now attempt to assign essentially what's a no-op function to this constant, I'm now going to get a runtime error. There we go. So now we see, assignment to constant variable. That it didn't like that. Don't do that, right? So this is good because now we can actually look for problems like this happening. We can try and fail gracefully, and we can certainly prevent things from becoming things that we didn't want them to become. Okay? So there we go, a little bit on assignment. We'll do Q&A at the end. So, yes. All right. So next thing is defining logic. Now, we've actually shown you a little bit of this already. As we see on the first line, get badges for records, that's that object literal notation again for declaring a function, okay? Now, there are certainly other ways to declare a function. In this instance, that function will be part of a sort of an object that belongs to the Lightning framework, right? But you can actually assign functions to the global context of JavaScript, and that's using something called var. So let's go and take a look at what that looks like. Actually, I think I'm going to do these two slides sort of back to back. So I'll do defining and then invoking logic. And we can see on some other lines here, like, so component is a parameter passed in, and then component.get, that's actually a method or a function of that particular object that we can then go and invoke. And in the context of Lightning components, you're always going to have some object that you're invoking the function from. We don't want to go to the global namespace or the global context. And in fact, Lightning tries really hard to stop you from going to that global context with locker service. So let's go and see a couple more little code snippets. And then what I want to get to is eventually talk about how this all works in the context of the single-threaded nature of JavaScript. All right. So here, we just have a couple of functions that we've defined. So var multiply and var square, those are actually going to live in the global context. On the other hand, I can define essentially the exact same functions, but have them be part of an object. So my maths object, and I was purposeful in using it in plural. I do live in the UK. But on the other hand, I wanted to make sure there wasn't some other math thing sitting around in JavaScript that I might sort of overwrite. I don't think there is. I think it's uppercase anyway.
I think it's uppercase with
but,
math, yeah.
And it is case sensitive. So, so you can see here that that's the declaration. And then invoking that is simply a matter of going through and making a call to each of those functions. And in the case of this square, that's the one that's sitting in the global context. And the other ones, we're calling the one that's wrapped in the object itself. Now, the last thing I want to mention in this invocation side of things is right here where I'm doing something called set timeout. Now, set timeout is kind of our first foray into the asynchronous nature of JavaScript. As I just mentioned, JavaScript is single-threaded. In other words, there's one call stack in the world of JavaScript in your browser. And so if something is in that call stack and blocking, then nothing else is happening in JavaScript. And so in order to work around this, JavaScript is designed to allow you to take a certain execution context and park it to allow other execution contexts to go to work, and then have a callback that can then go back to that execution context that you parked and execute that at a later time. And one really sort of basic way to do that is this set timeout thing. And you can see that I've actually set the timeout to 0 milliseconds here. And what's interesting is because of how that single-threaded nature and parking that execution context works, the first time you see this, you might think, well, I'm going to see this as async first before I see the rest of the console log calls here, right? But because we've parked this in this other execution context, what's actually going to happen is the first, all of this code will execute. Once that's done, the call stack will be cleared, and then we can go back to that function inside of set timeout and execute that after. So even though it is a 0 timeout, it still gets parked until the first execution context is done. And you can see it really clearly in the actual execution there, where we have the square of 4, the square of 5, and then 6 times 7. That all takes place, and then we get the async call that comes back afterward, okay? And this kind of sets us up nicely to talk more about this single-threaded nature and how asynchronous works in JavaScript. Checking my time, looking pretty good. All right. All right. Now, the first bold line up here, where we're doing component.get, this is an example of a synchronous call, right? Get is going to go and find something, and behind that get, there's going to be a return statement. So if you've ever used any of the C family of language, you will have seen a return statement. And that return, and unless it comes back with something quick-like, nothing else is going to happen after that get call, okay? So we'll only want to be synchronous when we can be assured that something's going to happen quickly and immediately. On the other hand, in action.setCallback, we have this function. Now, that function is called an anonymous function. It's the same thing as a lambda that you might see in other language. And essentially, it is an unnamed function that we can pass to an execution context to run in the future sometime, okay? There's actually a new way of declaring functions I'll mention. It's called arrow functions. So if you see that, it's still the same thing. And what this means is that, at some point in the future, we want all of this code to run So let's take a look at what that looks like. Now, I want to be clear that I didn't invent this way of representing the call stack and the web APIs and the callback queue. There's a really good talk on YouTube by a guy called Philip Roberts that was from JSConf EU 2014. And so I'm citing him here so that you can go and find his talk and watch the entire 30 minutes he goes through and talks about the event loop, because I think it's totally worth it. But this is sort of a summary of it, because I liked how he explained it. So if we look at what's going on, we have handle click at the top there, right? So there's handle click, and that calls helper.saveRecord. So handle click might be invoked by clicking a button, for example, on the UI. Helper.saveRecord then creates the action. Action has set callback, and then we have the anonymous function passed in. And so the way that's going to work is handle click goes in, we then call helper.saveRecord, and then eventually we call a.enqueueAction. And this is going to take that action and pass it off to the underlying web APIs. Now, action is actually just an abstraction of XML HTTP request, the thing that Josh was talking about earlier. So it's still underneath it. We're still going to those web APIs. You just don't really see them in their original form or the original structure. What's going to happen then is that action is going to sit there. It's encapsulating the XML HTTP request that goes out to Salesforce, gets some data, brings it back, and then that anonymous function is going to get stuck in the callback queue. And there it will sit, because ostensibly more will have gone on in your browser during that round trip to the Salesforce servers, right? So you're going to have, the user might be clicking on things, going here, going there, et cetera. Eventually, that call stack is going to be empty, and our callback function will be the next thing in the queue. And there's a thing called the event loop, and the event loop's only job is to look at the callback queue when the call stack is empty and push the next thing into the call stack so that we can make that thing happen. Now, how that is able to happen when the original execution context has finished is really the important final key thing that we want to cover, and that is closures. So closure is essentially the memory of a given execution context, right? So context one is the get badges for records function here. And just as you saw in my example where I had set timeout, this is the original execution context, and it's going to run from start to finish. But part of that is sticking that callback out there as well. And so all of the stuff in that callback creates a second execution context and a second closure. And what that closure means is that any of the data, the variables that are in the heap that are referenced by that particular closure will be held onto and will be made available until the time that this execution context gets pushed onto the stack, executed, and then maybe finished at some point, okay? And this is the fundamental thing that makes JavaScript work, is that, if you have a single-threaded execution engine, how do you make sure that nothing blocks that? Well, the key is you're constantly doing stuff, and then when you get to something that's going to take some time, you pass that off, and you say, okay, when you're ready, do that later. And the when you're ready is that callback, essentially. And that pretty much wraps up all of the sort of key bits of JavaScript we wanted to go through to kind of set that context. And Josh is going to kind of take us out of here.
All right, thank you, Peter. So to kind of take the level all the way back up, if, now hopefully when you're looking at some of this code, you've got a little bit of the background of how it's operating. If you want to see the exact code that we are working with in action, it's actually part of the Build an Instant Notification app. So this is one of the many modules that we have on Trailhead that somehow along the way is going to be picking up a Lightning controller for you to use. Now, we are throwing a lot of information in a very short period of time. Peter and I often joke that one of the constraints of our job is that we don't get 24 hours to talk to people, right? Like if we had full days where we could just kind of sit down and slow walk through every single topic, it would be a little bit easier. we have given you this trail mix so that you can kind of go back and hit a lot of the key topics that we are talking about. So there's a link here to the AJAX Wikipedia just to kind of link to that, but there's also a link to the JSConf talk that Peter is referencing on event loops. There's this great, like, I thought I remembered JavaScript guide, which will go back through some of the things about like how it's like kind of everything's an object and sort of truthy and falsy and things like that. So we give you this trail mix to kind of give you that backbone. I'm going to go ahead and say thank you and then go back to the bit.ly so that people don't have to keep asking where the bit.ly was. And we have just about 4 minutes left if there are any questions from anybody.
Yeah, so please use the microphones if you're going to ask questions. Oh, I think he's on it.
Is it down? There we are. So just a quick question on the debugging, whether it looked like it showed like a line number and actual character location where when you tried to assign the function
Oh,
to
for
the
the
string,
constant
that,
one?
like the equals was like right at that character. And since I'm just going to be starting and looking at Lightning components, any little snippet like, that's exactly where I need to look, would be really helpful.
The thing I would say for Lightning components is to make sure you get the Chrome plugin that's the Lightning debugger. So there's actually, for Chrome developer tools, there's a special debugger for Lightning components that I would recommend to everybody install and practice with.
Adam.
Right. So I think I'm still getting my head wrapped around some of the like anonymous functions. How do I know how many parameters they have? Like the function at the top had 3 parameters. I never defined that anywhere. And then the function in the callback had 1 parameter that you call either param or response. Like, does it always first of all, does it always have to have just 1 parameter? Does it always have to be called param or response? How do I know?
That's a really good function. That's a really good question. And actually, so in that anonymous function, we're actually declaring it here. We're not calling it. So this is the declaration. And how do I know that this one will have 3? Well, the API for set callback will tell you what that anonymous function should look like.
Okay.
Yeah.
As for the upper one, that's my own function, so I decide which ones those are.
Yeah,
Okay.
and some of that in the terms of Lightning is defined by the fact that this is the closure we're handing off to the greater framework. So that outer closure is always going to have like those 3 things. No, this is the helper class.
This is a helper.
This is the helper class.
Yeah.
So the helper class defined that, but in the controller, where it's like the component of the helper, then those are already defined for you by the framework.
Okay, and do I have to call it response, or can I call it whatever I want?
You can call it whatever you want.
Okay.
It's only going to be, so since that's a callback, that's going to be waiting for the queue to hit it, and then you can name that whatever you want, but that's what will be invoked by the response
Okay, so
itself.
because it's a callback, that's how I know it'll always have a .getState.
Exactly. So if you called it response or R, you would still be r.getState even if you gave it your own
because
name.
that's part of set callback. Okay,
Exactly.
cool, thank you.
Yep.
Yep.
So what are some of the reasoning you would use when determining whether to use JavaScript or something more native like Lightning, APEX, Visualforce, or even declarative? What's the decision making you kind of go when determining that?
Yeah, it's actually getting to be a little bit more distinct in the world of Lightning components because Lightning components makes a fairly clear distinction in the sand. So the execution of a Lightning component gets defined and then unpacked, and then everything we're interacting with the client is the nature of JavaScript, XML, HTML, and CSS. So we have this kind of delineation between what we're trying to present to the user, and then eventually we come back and say we have to ask a question to the server. And there's a little bit of blurring with like Lightning data services where we're trying to keep you from having to write that apex. But then if you do have to, like for instance, you have to grab a specific list by a filter, that's going to be a query statement within an apex. So in terms of Lightning experience, it's a little bit easier to tell because you kind of want that division of services between the JavaScript controller controlling things for the user or calling up to apex. And then it's like now, and once we remove ourselves from the world of UX, that's where you're going to be working with things like whether or not it's a process builder or Apex in the background. But JavaScript versus Apex, it's getting a little bit easier actually with a modern framework.
Okay, all right, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Hi.
We have about
So once I create a
10 seconds, so, but
once I
go
create
ahead.
a bundle, I have the Lightning JS controller, Apex. how do you test it? How do you write the test class to test all the bundles?
So there is
the
actually
components.
some new stuff in SFDX where you can write Jasmine. You can use Jasmine or the Lightning test, JavaScript unit testing framework of your choice, and you can roll that into SFDX.
And they've actually launched the Lightning testing framework too.
I believe just like now.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
spring,
I think this was
they
spring.
did GA on the Lightning testing framework.
Yeah. Otherwise, it goes back to the old school tricks of like console.log and pulling it into the Chrome debugger and things like that. But if you want more robust tools, Lightning testing service. There's not a Trailmix for Lightning testing service yet.
Yeah.
I would expect it to probably be in the next couple of releases.
Stay tuned. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your conference.